Don't touch her. You're a security guard. You don't tell management what to do. Then maybe management should stop threatening employees.
Julian,
It's
please.
okay.
That's not my signature.
Then whose is it?
I don't know.
Someone does.
Why is he talking to her like that?
Because he thinks nobody is watching.
What are you gonna do?
Watch.
Where is my son? Your son?
Yes. Dad. Son, you came early. I came because you finally found what I was looking for. What exactly did he find? That's what we're about to discuss.
Julian Bennett had been working inside his father's luxury hotel for 3 weeks, and not a single executive knew who he really was. Every morning, he put on the same Navy security uniform, clipped the silver badge to his chest, and walked through the marble lobby like an ordinary employee. That was exactly what he wanted. At 24, Julian had grown tired of watching people treat him differently whenever they heard the Bennett name. His father, Richard Bennett, had built a multi-million-dollar hotel empire, and Julian had spent most of his life surrounded by people who wanted something from his family. So he made his father a proposal. Let him work at the flagship hotel without revealing his identity. No special treatment, no executive office, no luxury car, just a security uniform and an ordinary paycheck. Richard agreed. But Julian quickly discovered that being invisible came with one unexpected advantage. People talked around him, and sometimes they said things they wouldn't say if they knew he was the owner's son. The first warning came from Maya Thompson. She approached Julian near the employee entrance late one afternoon, clutching a payroll envelope against your chest. "Can I ask you something?" Julian looked up. "Sure." "My overtime is missing again." His expression changed. "How much?" "Almost $600. Julian knew the hotel paid its employees well, but $600 was still significant. "Did you talk to payroll?" "I did." "And?" Maya lowered her voice. "They said my overtime wasn't approved." Julian studied her face. "But you worked the hours?" "Every single one." Before Julian could ask another question, Nathan Pierce appeared at the end of the hallway. Nathan was the hotel's operations manager. He was polished, respected, and trusted by Richard Bennett. "Maya," Nathan said sharply, "my office, now." Maya immediately lowered her eyes. Julian noticed the reaction. It wasn't irritation, it was fear. Nathan looked at Julian. "And you, get back to your post." Julian nodded, but he watched Maya disappear behind the executive office door. 30 minutes later, she emerged. Her eyes were red. Julian waited until Nathan was gone. "What happened?" Maya shook her head. "I can't lose this job." "Why would you?" "You don't understand." "Then help me understand." She hesitated, then whispered, "He told me if I keep complaining about overtime, he'll make sure nobody hires me anywhere else." Julian's jaw tightened. "Did Nathan say that?" Maya nodded. Julian didn't reveal his identity. Instead, he asked the question that mattered. "Does this happen to other employees?" Maya looked toward the executive offices. Then she quietly said, "Yes." That answer changed everything. Over the next few days, Julian started paying attention. He noticed employees checking their pay stubs in corners. He noticed supervisors becoming nervous whenever Nathan entered a room. He noticed complaints disappearing before they ever reached senior management. Then Maya returned to him with another document. "Look at this." Julian examined her payroll record. The overtime hours were clearly listed, but the payment was reduced. "Who changed this?" "I don't know." Julian looked toward the security cameras. "Do you still have the original?" Maya nodded. "It's in my locker." "Get it." She stared at him. "Why?" Julian folded the document.
because someone is lying. And for the first time, he realized this wasn't about one missing paycheck. Someone inside his father's company had created a system that depended on employees being too afraid to ask questions. Julian just didn't know how high that system reached. Yet.
Julian waited until the hotel became quiet before he began looking more closely at the payroll records Maya had shown him. He didn't access anything he wasn't authorized to see. He didn't break into offices or steal company files. Instead, he watched. He listened. And he compared what employees voluntarily told him with the paperwork they had been given. The pattern became harder to ignore. Employees were working overtime. The hours were being recorded, but the money wasn't always reaching them. Then, Julian discovered something even more disturbing. Several employees had signed documents confirming that they had received their full overtime payments. The employees insisted they had never signed those documents. Julian knew someone was manipulating the records, but he still didn't know who. One evening, while monitoring the hotel's security cameras, Julian noticed Nathan Pierce entering a private office. A payroll supervisor followed him inside. Julian watched the monitor carefully. The conversation couldn't be heard, but their body language told him enough. Nathan placed several documents on the desk. The payroll supervisor shook her head. Nathan leaned toward her. A few moments later, she picked up a pen and signed. Julian immediately called Maya. "Where are you? In the staff cafeteria? Don't move, I'll be there." When Julian arrived, Maya immediately noticed the concern on his face. "What happened?" "I need to ask you something." "What? Has Nathan ever asked you to sign a payroll correction?" Maya hesitated. Then she nodded. "Last month. Did you sign it?" "I thought it was correcting my hours. Did you read it?" "I trusted him." Julian's expression hardened. That trust appeared to be exactly what Nathan was exploiting. "Do you still have a copy?" "I'm sure. I threw it away." Before Julian could respond, his phone vibrated. A message had arrived from an unknown number. "They know you're asking questions." Julian stared at the screen. Maya noticed. "What is it?" Julian locked his phone. Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Someone knew he was investigating. The following morning, Nathan approached Julian near the lobby. "You've been spending a lot of time around the staff." Julian remained calm. "I'm security. I talk to employees." "Security means watching guests." Nathan stepped closer. "You're getting curious about things above your pay grade." Julian studied him. Maybe employees deserve someone to listen. Nathan's smile disappeared. "Be careful." Then he walked away. Julian watched him leave. Nathan hadn't denied anything. He had warned him. That afternoon, Maya was called into Nathan's office again. Julian watched her enter. 20 minutes passed, then 30. When Maya finally walked out, she looked devastated. Julian approached her. "What happened?" "They fired me." His stomach tightened. "Why?" "They said I falsified my hours." Julian immediately shook his head. "You didn't." "I know." Maya reached into her bag. "That's why I brought this." She handed him a small envelope. Inside was a copy of another payroll document. Julian examined it carefully. Then his eyes stopped. An approval code appeared beside the transfer, but it wasn't Nathan's code. Someone else had authorized it, someone with more authority. Julian looked at Maya. "Where did you get this?" "It was hidden behind my locker." "Who put it there?" "I don't know." Julian stared at the document.
Nathan might not be the person controlling the operation. He might only be protecting someone higher. That changed the entire investigation. Julian had expected to uncover a dishonest manager. Instead, he might have stumbled onto a scheme reaching deep into the hotel's corporate structure. And if that was true, exposing it could put far more than one employee's job at risk. It could threaten his father's entire company.
Julian returned to the hotel that night with one question consuming his mind. Who was really behind the missing money? Nathan Pierce had clearly been involved, but the document Maya discovered suggested someone above him had approved the transfers. Julian couldn't accuse anyone based on suspicion. He needed proof. So he continued watching. The following night, while monitoring the security cameras, Julian noticed Nathan entering the executive office after midnight. 20 minutes later, the payroll supervisor joined him. Then another person arrived. Julian recognized him immediately. It was the hotel's senior financial officer. The three men remained inside for nearly an hour. When they finally left, Nathan carried a thick folder. Julian couldn't see what was inside, but the meeting confirmed something important. Nathan wasn't working alone. The following morning, another employee approached Julian near the service entrance. My overtime disappeared too. Julian looked at him. How long? 4 months. How much are we talking about? The employee swallowed. More than $3,000. Julian's expression hardened. 3,000 from one employee. If dozens of employees were experiencing the same problem, the amount could be enormous. But where was the money going? That was the question Julian couldn't answer. Later that afternoon, Nathan found him alone in the hallway. "You need to stop." Julian turned around. "Stop what?" Nathan's expression was cold. "You know exactly what." Julian said nothing. Nathan stepped closer. "You're a security guard. You have no idea how corporations work." Julian looked directly into his eyes. "Maybe not, but I know when employees are being cheated." Nathan's face tightened. "You're making a serious accusation." "I'm asking questions. Questions can cost people their jobs." Julian paused. "Whose?" Nathan didn't answer. He simply walked away. That silence told Julian more than an explanation could have. Nathan was afraid. But who was he afraid of? That evening, Julian finally called his father. Richard answered almost immediately. "What did you find?" Julian hesitated. "You knew something was wrong." Richard didn't deny it. "I suspected something." "How much did you know?" "Not enough to act." Julian's voice became sharper. "People are losing money." "I know." "Maya lost her job." There was a long silence. "She didn't deserve that," Richard finally said. "No, she didn't." Julian took a breath. Then he asked the question that had been bothering him since the investigation began. "Why didn't you investigate this yourself?" Richard's answer was quiet. "Because when people know the owner is watching, they hide things." Julian understood immediately. His father had suspected corruption, but couldn't identify the people responsible. Richard continued, "I needed someone they wouldn't notice." Julian looked down at his security uniform. "So that's why you agreed." "I agreed because you wanted to learn what happens when nobody knows your name." Julian was silent. Then Richard said, "Bring me everything you found." Julian shook his head, even though his father couldn't see him. "I want to finish this myself." "Why?" "Because if I walk into that hotel as your son, everyone will tell me what they think I want to hear." Richard paused. Then he said, "All right." Julian ended the call. The next morning, he returned to work wearing the same uniform, but this time he knew exactly what he was looking for. He needed to identify where the money was going. Then Maya unexpectedly returned to the hotel. Julian stared at her. "What are you doing here?" She looked nervous. "I found something." "What?" She glanced around to make sure nobody was listening. "The account." Julian's expression changed. "What account?" "The one receiving the money." She handed him a document. Julian looked at it. His eyes moved across the page, then stopped. The approval code matched the document he had already seen, but the name attached to it wasn't Nathan Pierce. It belonged to someone with authority over the hotel's financial operations, someone much closer to Richard than Julian had expected. For the first time, Julian realized the truth could destroy a trusted relationship inside his father's company, and there was only one way to bring it into the open. His father had to come to the hotel. But Julian had no idea that Richard was already on his way.
The next morning, Julian arrived at the hotel before sunrise. He still wore the Navy's security uniform, but everything felt different now. For weeks, he had walked through those doors as a stranger. Now, he knew that somewhere inside the building, someone had been redirecting money that belonged to employees. He also knew Nathan Pierce wasn't acting alone. Julian kept Maya's document secured. He needed to make sure the evidence couldn't disappear. Then, shortly after 9 o'clock, the atmosphere inside the hotel suddenly changed. Employees began whispering. Managers hurried toward the entrance. Senior executives straightened their jackets. Julian looked toward the revolving doors. Richard Bennett had arrived. The owner walked into the lobby wearing a black tailored suit, white shirt, dark silk tie, and platinum wristwatch. Every executive immediately gathered around him. Nathan Pierce was among them. But when Nathan looked across the lobby and saw Julian, his expression changed. Richard noticed. He slowly turned toward the security desk. Their eyes met. Richard walked directly toward his son. "Son?" The entire lobby went silent. Maya stared at Julian. Nathan's face went pale. Julian removed his security badge. "Dad." Nathan looked from Julian to Richard. "You knew?" Richard's expression remained calm. "I knew my son was working here." Nathan looked stunned. "But why?" Julian stepped forward. "Because I wanted to know what happened when nobody knew my last name." Richard looked around the lobby. "Then let's find out." They moved into the executive conference room. Julian placed the payroll records on the table. Maya's documents followed. Then came the evidence showing the altered overtime records and approval codes. Richard studied everything carefully. Finally, he looked at Nathan. "Explain this." Nathan swallowed. "I didn't create the system." "Then who did?" Nathan remained silent. Julian watched him closely. "You threatened employees." Nathan shook his head. "I was protecting the company." "No," Julian said. "You were protecting someone." Nathan looked toward the senior financial officer. The room became completely silent. Richard followed his gaze. "Is that true?" The executive lowered his eyes. Julian placed the final document on the table. The transfers were approved through his authorization code. The executive finally spoke. The system was already broken. Richard's voice hardened. "Where did the money go?" No one answered.
Richard immediately ordered an independent audit and suspended the executives involved, while the company's legal and financial teams investigated the records. Then he turned toward Maya. "You were fired for reporting a problem that was real." Maya's eyes filled with tears. Richard continued, "Your position will be restored. Your unpaid wages will be reviewed and corrected." Maya looked at Julian. He gave her a small nod. The investigation would continue, but the employees were finally being heard. Later that evening, Richard and Julian stood alone in the hotel lobby. Julian removed his security jacket. "I thought you were testing me." Richard smiled. "I was." Julian looked at him. "But I was testing myself, too." "What did you learn?" Julian looked around the hotel. "That money can open doors, but it doesn't tell you what's happening behind them." Richard nodded. Julian continued, "I don't want an executive office." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Then what do you want?" "I want to rebuild the employee relations department." Richard smiled. "Are you willing to start at the bottom?" Julian looked at the security uniform in his hands. "I think I already did." Months later, the hotel had changed. Payroll procedures were strengthened. Employee complaints were independently reviewed. Overtime records were audited, and Maya returned to work without fear. Julian never forgot the lesson. His family name could have solved the problem instantly, but if he had entered the hotel as the owner's son, he might never have discovered the truth. Wealth could buy comfort, it could buy influence, it could buy beautiful buildings and powerful connections, but it could never buy character. Character had to be earned, and Julian had learned that leadership wasn't about being recognized. It was about protecting people who had no power. If this story reminded you that integrity matters more than money, subscribe for more stories about wealth, family, betrayal, justice, and second chances. And tell everyone watching where you're watching from. Leave your city or country in the comments. If this story made you think about someone who stood up for what was right when nobody was watching, share it with them. Because sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the person who sees the truth first.